Initially, for the last theme, I was actually planning to draw Amita from the side so that we could see her face. I had a couple different poses planned out. Unfortunately, in my original mock-ups, things didn't go that well. I ended up in kind of the uncanny valley area where there was like slight issues that just ended up making it look really bad, and I couldn't figure out why. So I did some digging. I read a couple books, including some from the Morpho series and some from the point character drawing series by Taco from Legion. I realized that part of the issue was that I was drawing half with stylization and half with realistic style, because I've naturally, in my time studying art and practicing art, trended towards realistic drawings because I usually draw from reference and have been trained to draw from reference back in school. Unfortunately, that ends up in the uncanny valley area where if you try and draw eyes or a mouth in a stylistic way, and you try and draw the proportions of that head in a stylistic way, but you don't know how, the proportions are just off. And I also don't think I got the proportions right in the first place. I didn't make the eyes big enough. I made the jawline too close to where like the midline of the face should be, things like that. And so I decided this time for my art study to actually genuinely try and look at someone who does stylization, but also trends towards realism and can still make that look good. And the first artist that I could think of that does this is Julia Lepetit. For those who don't know, Julia Lepetit is an artist who's a part of the YouTube channels Drawfee and Secret Sleepover Society. I would say Julia is known for three big things in the community. The first being horror. She's very good at drawing grotesque, terrifying, uncanny things in a very realistic way. The second one is, let's just say not remembering well-known intellectual properties. Yeah. Anyway, the last one is her high attention to detail and dedication towards realism in terms of, for instance, in Drawtectives Season 1, she counted how many support beams were in the manor to make sure it was consistent across all of the different backgrounds. I say all of that, but honestly, if I'm being completely genuine with you, the real reason why I'm choosing Julia is in part because it gives me an excuse to talk about my favorite character from Drawtectives, whose name is Eugene Finch. He's a fan favorite among the community because he is adorable, awkward, and handsome, which is truly the perfect combination of a person. For this study, I broke things down into roughly 3 phases. Phase number 1 is to imitate directly. So that means basically looking at what she's drawn and trying to copy it. Phase 2 is more of a looser imitation. I'm still trying to draw Eugene, but instead of drawing off of a reference that she has drawn, I'm using my knowledge of anatomy and trying to use the things that I've learned from studying her to draw a new expression on Eugene. In the third and final phase, I've compiled everything that I've learned in the earlier phases to try and draw an expression on a character of my own. With this first pass through drawing Eugene over and over and over again, I didn't focus on the rendering side of things. I really just wanted to get the structure, the proportions, the shapes, the lines, things like that. The first thing I noticed is that Julia has really great line quality and variation. A really great example of this is the dimple on Eugene's cheek, which gets a little bit deeper in the actual crevice of where the dimple would appear. So it kind of gives a little bit of a 3D depth to it, even though it is just a line. All that said, I'm not really focusing as much on the line variation in this study because There is a way for me to do it in Adobe Illustrator using the width tool, but it is a little finicky and I would rather just get more studies out quickly. That goes doubly so because I'm really more interested in figuring out the proportions and the anatomy and how that interacts with the stylization. The next thing to note is that Julia isn't afraid of adding lines to a face. I think this kind of shows a lot because she has a tendency to draw older people or people with kind of more wrinkles or lines or blemishes and things like that. In this particular case, she's not afraid to draw the crease in the eyebrow, but she's also not afraid to draw a line on the nose to try and give a little bit more depth or angular features to him. As a fairly beginner artist myself, I often end up in a situation when I'm trying to draw something where I trend towards making it look too perfect. And I really want to get out of that habit, especially when it comes to faces, because I think some of the beauty when it comes to drawing different characters is those little imperfections and those little qualities that other characters wouldn't have. As we move into the next study, I do want to just say I am absolutely reusing the head and the hair because I'm focused on the facial expression. I think most of the times when we're talking about practice, that's not really ideal because you should be redrawing them. But in this case, I'm just trying to get a sense of where parts of the face should go when you have different expressions. To note here, just as a full disclosure, I am not going to reuse any of the assets that I made in this, whether it be a nose, a mouth line, whatever. I'm not going to use any of it and call it my own art. This stays in this art study file. I also want to point out that I'm pretty sure Julia just reused the head in this case too to make sure that he stays in one place and it doesn't look jumpy when he changes expressions. In this case, I thought it was interesting how many of the lines in the bottom half of the face disappeared as his lips kind of go forward and towards the left hand of our screen. I kind of expected there to be at least one extra line instead of having like the chin area combined with the lower lip. And the dimple obviously went completely away because his mouth is moving so far forward that the dimple wouldn't appear anymore. That makes a lot of sense, but the combination of the two lines underneath the lip were a little bit surprising to me. On top of that, the lines underneath the eyes, the little tiny ones, those ones were also kind of unusual to me. But as I drew them, I kind of figured out why. He's squinting his eyes, so you would see more wrinkles under there. But in this case, we're trying not to show too much, I guess. I don't know, maybe I just kind of expected there to be more lines underneath the eyes considering all of the things that she normally does. The only thing that really changes in this one is the mouth. Everything else stays the same. I don't really love how the mouth turned out because honestly, it's hard for me to get this kind of a shape line combo in Adobe Illustrator without pulling out a pen, which I can't do because of my wrist injury. But I do think that I got some of the shapes right. I think I just made the teeth too big and also probably too white. I'm not really focusing too much on getting the colors on this one. I'm straight up color picking most of the time, but I just went with white for the teeth this time because it was a little easier. I had a lot of fun with this one because so much of it changed. The nose stayed the same and the eyes stayed mostly the same. I think they ended up squinting a little bit, which makes sense because when you smile, your cheeks end up kind of pushing your lower lid up to cover more of your eye. And the dimple pulled back also makes sense when you're smiling because your cheeks pull up and back. And I do think she actually redrew the eyebrows as well, which tracks because before it was a little bit more of a quirked eyebrow. And that leads us into the imitation that I was most looking forward to doing. At the end of season 2, there's this really intense dramatic moment where Eugene is very, very mad about something. I am not going to spoil it. You're going to have to watch it. But I think it's very notable that Julia tilted his head down, because this is the very first time we have seen him, at least his live self that can talk, in a different position than his standard upright kind of talking expression. In this case, he's leaning forward, and that kind of contrast leaves a lot of impact in the moment. The thing that surprised me most with this one is how many lines she added. Because on the left eye alone, she added an extra line above the furrowed brow from before, and she added 3 lines underneath the eye, which does make sense when you're sneering or kind of glaring at someone. Your eyes do squint a little, and that is going to naturally lead to more lines. But I think it also gives the effect of him just being exhausted by the end of this season 2. There are also some changes to the lower half of the face. The mouth obviously had its shape changed. He's clearly frowning here, and I do appreciate this, because I think when we draw smiley faces, or I guess a frowny face, we'll normally just draw an upside down U, but this does make more sense from an anatomy perspective, because the mouth doesn't just turn into an upside down U. There's parts of it that will just get more tense, parts of it will go down, but not all of it will. And it often depends on the person, because I do know people who can actually frown in a U shape, but it's not necessarily natural. I also like how she decreased the length of the lines in the bottom half of the face, because it kind of lends to this image of his lips thinning out as he's tightening his mouth while frowning, because you're seeing less of that shape, the hinted shape of his lips, and instead you're just seeing primarily that line in between the top and bottom of the lip. I also think that lack of detail in the bottom half of the face ends up drawing your eyes upward towards the eyes, which are a complete glare. And I think that ultimately does a great job of showing off the actual emotion in this scene, which is that anger directed towards someone. I want to talk about a couple things that changed from season 2 Eugene to season 3 Eugene. Obviously, there's the clothes and the hair, which are both incredible, but there are also a couple changes to the way Julia drew his face. So let's dive into what changed. The first thing I noticed was the eyes. This is probably because it was the hardest shape that I had to recreate in the very first couple imitations. The eyes ended up being a little bit bigger. This kind of gives him a little bit more of a doe-eyed look. He's a little cuter now, he's a little softer. This makes sense with his character, because in season 2, he did not know who he was. And no one, including him, knew if he was a good person or a bad person or just a normal guy. In season 3, he now has a little bit more confidence in himself. He knows who he is, and we know that he's a friend. The next thing I noticed was the lips. Not because I'm down bad, hear me out. It's more because the shape is very different from before. Up until this point, Eugene's mouth has largely just been that line, which does kind of track with a lot of what Julia draws, but in this case, he actually has fuller lips. Is this because he's now a little bit poutier? He's just kind of a sad, adorable, handsome man who's kind of useless, instead of being a potentially threatening person who has nefarious motives? Who knows? Is it because the fandom has latched onto him and thinks he's adorable? That's also possible. It could also just be because Julia drew him that way on a whim. Who knows? So after comparing season 2 Eugene with season 3 Eugene, I jumped back into the imitation phase so that I could draw him in season 3. As much as I said a lot of things changed, a lot of things stayed the same. His nose is still the same shape, his head is still the same shape. In fact, his eyebrows, I think, are maybe even copied over. Same with his dimple. But ultimately, He's got the same hairline, he's got the same head shape, all that jazz. I felt a little bit more comfortable with this one. Up until this point, I've largely ignored the hair because I'm not really paying attention to it for an expression study. That said, his hair is a little bit flatter and there's more depth to it. I think this kind of ends up making him a little bit fluffier, and it also makes him seem less of a showman. I'm not really sure about it. It feels a little bit more like he's just some guy who has nice hair and is handsome, instead of being some over-the-top potential villain. After phase 1, which is all about imitating Julia's actual art, I moved into phase 2, which is about trying to draw without references. I'm still starting from a pre-made base, which is the neutral face of season 3, but I'm adjusting them without any references other than an emoji and how it feels when I move my own face. One of the first things that I do in each one of these is to adjust the eyebrows because I felt that that was a little bit easier. I know they're not going to go too far lower than where the eyes are and too far higher than, where they are currently, because they are stuck to your face. They're not going to shift that much, but they can shift a decent amount, and they end up giving a lot of impact on the expression at the end. Beyond that, I did try opening his mouth. I'm not sure how Julia would have done this with his new lip shape. That said, I'm not super pleased with how the mouth turned out. I think that I probably could have decreased the lines in the bottom half of the face to draw the attention up towards the eyes, like with that one really intense image, particularly because this is supposed to be an expression of fear. This one was really fun because I do think this kind of judging face is really out of character for Eugene. It was also pretty fun because the sweat drops are really easy to do, and it does give off a pretty clear sense of, oh, I'm concerned about what you're doing right now expression. That said, the big changes were to the eyebrows, which come down and furrow a little bit because he's kind of frowning and judging you a little bit, and his mouth is a little bit less open, but still a little bit open, because it's not so much, oh god, my jaw has dropped, and it's more of a, I can't bring myself to close my mouth because I'm too focused on whatever weird thing you're doing. Overall, this was a fun one. It was neat to draw because I really don't think Eugene would make this face, and if he did, god, I would love to see the real one. The last one was really just for shits and giggles because, frankly, I don't think Eugene would ever emote this strongly, but I just really wanted to draw him a little surprised and embarrassed because I just think it would be a funny moment to see. I did pull the jaw down as though his jaw is dropping, but I also pulled the upper lip down a little bit so that it's trying to stay closed. He's trying to keep composure. He's just a little surprised. He can't close his mouth though. The other big thing that changed is the eyebrows, because as they rise, the eyes widen a little bit because the upper lid is being pulled up by the eyebrows. And of course, we also have to leave it with the good old blush marks because it is that face. I didn't really expect it, but I actually really enjoyed doing this. Up until now, I've felt really anxious and kind of tense when it comes to drawing faces. I think it's because there's just so much detail that you could add and so many different decisions you have to make with the face. It's a pretty complex thing. And on top of that, every time I've tried in the past, I've just gotten little choices wrong and it ended up looking kind of uncanny or off-putting or just the wrong expression. But this was really fun to do, and I'm really glad for that because I think that's one of the great things about doing art studies like this. It's a good way to get practice in on the things that you're not as confident in, but you also get to be excited about something that you enjoy, like Eugene Finch from Drawtectives. So now, in phase 3, I tried drawing my own character. This is Duval. He's an interior designer in a world where superpowers exist. In his case, when he touches something, he can witness memories of the object, which he can't really control, and he is currently trying to design a penthouse for someone who can read minds, and isn't very good at communicating. That client is Agent Bryn Summersmith, who does not appear in this piece, but that person is really, really bad at communicating his needs because he's kind of given up on it. He's had a hard life because he hears everybody's thoughts, and he lives in a city because he has to for his job. And he goes through a really rough time, and he's doing his best. But he comes off as very gruff and very angry because he always has a headache, and he doesn't know how to communicate very well because he mishears things sometimes. This piece, I want to show that Duvall is confused and frustrated, but just still determined to make this design work. So it shouldn't be too distraught or too upset. It should just be kind of a mild amount of annoyance with a decent amount of just deep in thought trying to figure this out. And I think with the things that I've learned from Julia, I managed to pull it off. So all of that being the case, although I am going for a kind of simplified style, I'm not changing the proportions super significantly. I'm trying to keep them fairly realistic instead of going for something like an anime style with the big forehead and the big eyes and all that jazz. I tried to keep in mind what I learned from the art study about things like keeping the mouth fairly simple, since I want to draw more attention up towards the eyes this time. In this case, I'm not using the Eugene style eyes because, again, I'm not trying to rote copy her. That's not the goal here. It's an art study, it's not an art copy. I also think that I probably could have done a little bit better of a job of adding in more lines. He's supposed to be in his 30s, so he might have a couple wrinkles here and there. I know I sure do, and I'm not even 30 yet. But I do think I probably could have done that a little bit better. I'll probably try and do a little bit more of that in the future as I draw more characters. Another thing I'm really proud of is how I adjusted the eyes to match the shape of the eyebrows. This is a realistic anatomy thing. It's just the way your face works. As your eyebrows go up, your eyes get wider. As your eyebrows come down, your eyes get smaller. That's just how it works. That said, I did learn a lot from practicing with Eugene, because in the imitation where I was drawing the squinting face that he does, his eyes do get more narrow as his eyebrows come down. And when I did the no reference, non-imitation study of him with his eyebrows going up and he's embarrassed, his eyes do get wider in that one, and it looks quite realistic. I think I did a pretty good job of that in this case, because I think the eyes do make sense with the shape of the eyebrows in this case. Overall, I'm pretty happy with this study. I think I did a pretty good job and I got a lot of good practice in. I also know that I learned a lot when it comes to the positioning of things on the face and how things move and change from one expression to another. It was very valuable time for me. If you're a beginner artist or an artist that is trying to get a sense of the anatomy of the face and how it can change in different expressions or different angles, I would definitely recommend doing this sort of a practice or this sort of a study, because just drawing different expressions on the same character and trying to reuse it and just adjust things can really train your eye in the same time as it's training your sense of how to draw things. It can add to your mental library and also train your eye at the same time. If you try doing a study like this, I would love to hear how it goes, so please do let me know. You can always write in the comments of this video, or if you'd prefer, you can always respond to a post I make on Tumblr. Alternatively, if you want to make my day better, I would love to see more silly expressions of Eugene Finch. I just think it would be funny, so please do draw more of him. There are already some great artists out there who are drawing him, and I can't wait to see what happens in the rest of Season 3. So, thanks for watching.